Hollywood's history is paved with dreams that crashed and faltered at the box office. 1973 stands out as a particularly challenging year when some of the industry's most ambitious projects became its costliest mistakes. These weren't just disappointing movies, they were financial catastrophes that shook studios to their core and ended careers overnight. What's most fascinating is that many of these so-called disasters would later be recognized as misunderstood masterpieces. The film industry has always been a high-stakes gamble, but 1973 seemed determined to humble even Hollywood's most powerful players, leaving a trail of financial losses and shattered expectations that would become legendary in industry circles. Major studios and independent producers alike watched in dismay as their prized projects were rejected by audiences and criticized by reviewers, creating a perfect storm of commercial failure. The early 70s marked a turning point for American cinema. The old studio system was crumbling, and a new generation of filmmakers was pushing boundaries. But this creative renaissance came with enormous financial risks. Studios poured millions into productions they believed would revolutionize filmmaking, only to watch in disappointment as audiences stayed away in droves. The failures of 1973 would reshape Hollywood's approach to financing films for decades to come. It was a year that saw filmmakers given unprecedented creative freedom, yet that same freedom produced some of the industry's most spectacular financial disappointments. The economic recession gripping America certainly didn't help matters, as ticket sales declined across the board and audiences became increasingly selective about which films deserved their hard-earned dollars. This perfect storm of creative experimentation, economic downturn, and changing audience tastes created ideal conditions for box office underperformance. Perhaps no film embodies 1973's box office disasters better than Lost Horizon, a musical remake that earned the devastating nickname Lost Investment. Columbia Pictures gambled over $6 million, equivalent to over $40 million today, on updating Frank Capra's beloved 1937 classic as a lavish musical. The studio believed the combination of exotic locations, elaborate musical numbers, and a star-studded cast would guarantee success. Instead, it delivered one of the most embarrassing failures in Hollywood history. The film's very concept seemed fundamentally misguided, taking a philosophical adventure film about discovering a hidden utopia and transforming it into a musical extravaganza with dance numbers and romantic subplots that clashed wildly with the source material's tone. Columbia executives, still riding high from the success of Oliver a few years earlier, they convinced themselves audiences were hungry for more big-budget musicals. This catastrophic miscalculation would haunt the studio for years. Production challenges plagued Lost Horizon from the start. The film's budget constraints created a bizarre visual disconnect. While exterior shots featured breathtaking landscapes, most interior scenes looked like badly decorated Chinese restaurants. Critics were unimpressed, with Pauline Kael famously calling it a big, stale marshmallow. Audiences agreed, quickly leaving theaters after word spread about the film's awkward musical numbers and stilted performances. When the dust settled, Lost Horizon had recouped just a fraction of its massive budget, leaving Columbia executives scrambling to explain the disappointment to shareholders. The casting choices didn't help matters, with non-singers like Peter Finch and Liv Ullmann struggling through musical numbers that demanded vocal talents they simply didn't possess. Composer Burt Bacharach, normally a hitmaker, delivered songs that felt jarringly out of place with the film's supposedly mystical setting, and director Charles Jarrett, whose previous film, Anne of the Thousand Days, had been a critical and commercial success, seemed completely out of his depth handling the musical elements. The resulting film pleased absolutely no one. Fans of the original novel found it unfaithful, musical enthusiasts found the songs forgettable, and general audiences were simply uninterested. The financial setbacks weren't limited to big-budget musicals. The Friends of Eddie Coyle, a gritty crime drama starring Robert Mitchum, demonstrated that critical acclaim doesn't necessarily translate to box office success. Despite earning a remarkable 98% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and featuring what many consider Mitchum's finest performance, the film failed to connect with mainstream audiences. Mitchum's portrayal of the aging, desperate, small-time criminal, Eddie Coyle, stands as one of cinema's most nuanced depictions of a man caught in circumstances beyond his control. His performance stripped away all Hollywood glamour, presenting instead a weary, defeated man making one last desperate attempt to avoid prison. This raw authenticity, while earning critical praise, proved too bleak for audiences accustomed to more conventional crime thrillers, where criminals were either glamorized or unambiguously villainous. Set in Boston's criminal underworld, Eddie Coyle offered a stark, unflinching look at the life of a small-time arms dealer facing prison. Director Peter Yates crafted a masterclass in understated storytelling, but Paramount's marketing department struggled to position the film. Too bleak for mainstream audiences, yet too conventional for the art house crowd, it fell between the cracks. Though the film barely earned back its modest budget, its reputation has grown exponentially over the decades. Today, filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Martin Scorsese cite it as a major influence, proving commercial failure doesn't always equal artistic failure. The film's documentary-like approach to Boston's criminal underworld, with its authentic locations and natural dialogue, would later be recognized as revolutionary, influencing countless crime films that followed. But in 1973, this stark realism wasn't what audiences wanted. They were seeking either escapist entertainment or the kind of stylized operatic crime stories that The Godfather had popularized the previous year. Eddie Coyle's refusal to romanticize its criminal characters or provide cathartic justice made it commercially unviable despite its artistic achievements. Another critical darling that flopped at the box office was Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye. Altman's subversive take on Raymond Chandler's detective novel featured Elliot Gould as a mumbling, disheveled Philip Marlowe, a radical departure from the character's traditional portrayal. The studio expected a straightforward noir, but got something much stranger and more satirical. Released with little fanfare, the film confused audiences expecting a traditional detective story. Altman's irreverent approach to the material horrified Chandler purists while leaving casual viewers bewildered by its meandering plot and unusual tone. The director deliberately subverted every noir convention, from the moody lighting, replacing it with sun-drenched Los Angeles locations, to the hard-boiled dialogue, having Gould mutter most of his lines almost inaudibly. The famous tagline, "Nothing matters, it's the long goodbye," perfectly captured Altman's nihilistic vision, but did little to attract moviegoers seeking traditional entertainment. United Artists barely promoted the film, uncertain how to market Altman's idiosyncratic vision. Despite being one of the most interesting crime stories of the decade, The Long Goodbye vanished quickly from theaters. Altman's reimagining of the genre was simply too ahead of its time for 1973 audiences. Like many films on this list, it would later be recognized as a masterpiece, influencing generations of filmmakers who appreciated its deconstruction of noir conventions. The film's commercial failure convinced United Artists to limit their support for Altman's subsequent projects, believing his artistic vision too esoteric for mainstream audiences. This short-sightedness would come back to haunt them when Altman delivered the massively successful Nashville just 2 years later, proving that his unique filmmaking approach could connect with audiences when properly marketed. But the damage to The Long Goodbye had already been done, with the film barely making a dent at the box office despite its artistic significance. Speaking of visionaries misunderstood in their time, few directors have experienced the commercial rejection that greeted Terrence Malick's debut feature, Badlands. Despite its modest budget, the film still managed to lose money for Warner Brothers, starring Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek. This lyrical take on a crime spree across the American Midwest featured the meditative style and stunning nature cinematography that would become Malick's trademark. But 1973 audiences utterly rejected his artistic approach. Malick's background as a philosophy professor at MIT informed his unique filmmaking style, which prioritized visual poetry and philosophical musings over traditional narrative development. His approach to the real-life story of Charles Starkweather and his teenage girlfriend Carol Ann Fugate deliberately avoided psychological explanations or moral judgments, instead presenting their journey with an almost dreamlike detachment that bewildered audiences accustomed to more straightforward crime narratives. Warner Brothers executives, who had expected something more commercially viable, were baffled by the finished film and had no idea how to market it effectively. Badlands moved at a glacial pace compared to other crime films of the era, prioritizing mood and visual poetry over conventional plotting. Warner Brothers had no idea how to market such an unusual film and essentially dumped it into limited release. The box office returns were dismal, but those with a taste for slow, meditative art house movies recognized this was a significant new voice in cinema. Today, Badlands is considered one of the greatest American films ever made, but in 1973, it was just another financial disappointment. The contrast between its initial reception and subsequent reputation couldn't be more striking. The film now regularly appears on critics' lists of the greatest films ever made and has been preserved in the National Film Registry for its cultural significance. But at the time of its release, it played to nearly empty theaters before being pulled from circulation, with Warner Bros. Writing it off as an expensive mistake. Malick himself would wait 5 years before making another film, suggesting the commercial failure of his debut had significant consequences for his career trajectory. Even star power couldn't guarantee success in 1973. MGM's highest budgeted film that year was The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing, starring Burt Reynolds at the height of his popularity, alongside British actress Sarah Miles. The studio expected the Western romance to capitalize on Reynolds' recent successes, but the production was plagued by behind-the-scenes drama that overshadowed the film itself. Reynolds had just come off major hits like Deliverance and White Lightning, establishing himself as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. MGM believed his presence alone would guarantee box office success, especially in a Western, still a popular genre at the time. The studio spared no expense, funding extensive location shooting across the American Southwest and assembling a supporting cast of veteran character actors to complement the two leads. But troubles began almost immediately, with reports of tension between Reynolds and Miles on set and constant script revisions that confused both cast and crew. Director Richard Sarafian, known for the cult hit Vanishing Point, struggled to maintain control of the increasingly chaotic production. The most devastating blow came when David Whiting, Sarah Miles' personal assistant, was found deceased in her hotel room during production. Though ruled self-inflicted, the incident created a media frenzy that tainted the film's release. When Cat Dancing finally reached theaters, audiences were disappointed by its uneven tone, and critics delivered decidedly mixed reviews. Most fans of the original novel found the adaptation lacking, and the film quietly disappeared from theaters, having failed to recoup its considerable budget. The production had been plagued by constant rewrites, with the studio pushing for more action and romance while minimizing the story's darker elements. The resulting film satisfied neither Western fans seeking action nor audiences expecting a sweeping romance. Reynolds later admitted the production had been troubled from the start, with creative differences between the director, stars, and studio executives creating a film that lacked a cohesive vision. MGM's financial investment, reported to be over $3 million, a significant sum for a Western in 1973, made the film's failure particularly painful for the struggling studio. Crossing the Atlantic, we find another legendary box office disaster that would later gain cult status. The Wicker Man, a British horror film starring Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee, suffered one of the most troubled releases in cinema history. Despite a modest budget of approximately £500,000, the film was considered a significant investment for struggling British lion films. Studio executives reportedly disliked The Wicker Man upon viewing it, believing its pagan themes and lack of conventional horror elements would alienate audiences. Their solution? Cutting the film drastically and releasing it as the bottom half of a double bill. This approach ensured the film would struggle financially, and indeed British Lion wrote off a $470,000 loss. Christopher Lee called the studio's handling of the film an appalling mistake. Despite earning around $885,000 worldwide, The Wicker Man was considered so unsuccessful that it nearly ended director Robin Hardy's career. Decades later, it would be recognized as one of the most influential horror films ever made. Not all box office disasters of 1973 enjoyed later critical redemption. Blackenstein, an attempt to capitalize on the blaxploitation horror trend, remains as criticized today as it was upon release. With a microscopic budget, even by 1973 standards, the film suffered from wooden acting, clumsy editing, and a monster design that looked more laughable than frightening. Critics weren't impressed with Blackenstein for its sluggish pacing and lack of suspense, with many noting the monster spends more time walking slowly down hallways than actually frightening victims. While other low-budget blaxploitation films like Blackula had managed to turn profits despite poor reviews, audiences rejected Blackenstein outright. The film failed to recoup even its minimal production costs, effectively killing any chance of a franchise. Unlike other films on this list, time has not been kind to Blackenstein, which remains primarily of interest to enthusiasts of cult cinema. Lady Caroline Lamb, released in the US in 1973 after its UK debut the previous year, represented another type of box office disaster. the prestige project that fails to translate across markets. Robert Bolt's directorial debut, starring his wife Sarah Miles as the aristocrat who famously described Lord Byron as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, enjoyed modest success in Britain but bombed spectacularly in America. The lavish costume drama featured impressive production values and performances from a distinguished cast including Richard Chamberlain and Laurence Olivier. While it became one of the most popular films at the British box office, American audiences found its exploration of Regency-era scandals too-mannered and distinctly European. The film's U.S. distributor suffered a significant financial hit, writing off the American release as a complete loss. Bolt never directed another feature film, returning to his successful career as a screenwriter. Few directors experienced the level of studio interference that plagued Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. The troubled Western, starring James Coburn and Chris Christopherson, became a legendary example of a filmmaker's vision being compromised by corporate meddling. MGM executives, unhappy with Peckinpah's initial cut, took control of the film and released a drastically edited version that the director disowned. The result was a commercial disappointment. Critics found fault with the disjointed theatrical cut, and audiences stayed away despite the film's star power and Bob Dylan soundtrack. MGM took a significant financial hit, and Peckinpah's already contentious relationship with Hollywood studios was further strained. Years later, when a version closer to Peckinpah's original vision was finally released, critics recognized it as one of the director's finest works. But in 1973, it was just another high-profile letdown in a year filled with disappointments. The string of box office disappointments continued with Scarecrow, starring Gene Hackman and Al Pacino as drifters forming an unlikely friendship while traveling to California. Despite winning the prestigious Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, the road movie failed to connect with American audiences. Warner Brothers barely promoted the film, uncertain how to market its blend of comedy and drama. Though made for a modest budget, Scarecrow still failed to break even, disappearing quickly from theaters despite the star power of its two leads. Jeremy, a small-budget romantic drama about two teenagers falling in love while attending a performing arts school in New York City, represented a different kind of financial disappointment. Despite critical appreciation for its sensitive portrayal of young love and impressive performances from its young leads, the film failed to find its audience. United Artists gave it a limited release, but without major stars or marketing, Jeremy quickly faded from theaters. Though it cost relatively little to produce, its box office returns were so minimal that it still qualifies as a financial failure. Action star Charles Bronson, usually reliable at the box office, delivered a rare commercial disappointment with The Stone Killer. Despite its intense content and Bronson's popularity, the police thriller underperformed expectations significantly. Critics dismissed it as a generic action film, and audiences seemingly agreed, making it one of Columbia Pictures' poorest performers that year. The film's failure was particularly surprising given Bronson's consistent track record and director Michael Winner's previous successes. Rounding out 1973's most notable flops was Electra Glide in Blue, starring Robert Blake as a motorcycle cop with ambitions of becoming a homicide detective. Director James William Guercio, better known as Chicago's producer, created a visually stunning film that drew comparisons to Easy Rider with its panoramic desert landscapes. Critics generally praised its unique visual style and Blake's performance, but audiences largely ignored it upon release. Despite its modest budget, Electra Glide failed to break even, becoming yet another film from 1973 that would later gain cult status without initial commercial success. The box office disasters of 1973 reveal much about an industry in transition. Hollywood was caught between the collapse of the old studio system and the rise of blockbuster filmmaking that would begin with Jaws just 2 years later. This uncertain middle ground created space for ambitious failures, many of which would eventually be recognized as ahead of their time. The industry was still reeling from the financial excesses of the late 1960s, when massive productions like Hello, Dolly and Dr. Dolittle had lost fortunes for their respective studios. Yet executives hadn't yet embraced the high-concept, marketing-driven approach that would come to dominate in the late 1970s and beyond. This transitional period allowed filmmakers unprecedented creative freedom, but that same freedom often resulted in commercially unviable projects that confused marketing departments and alienated mainstream audiences. The failures of 1973 would serve as cautionary tales for studio executives. leading to more conservative approaches to greenlighting projects and the gradual erosion of director-driven filmmaking that had briefly flourished in the early 1970s. What's most remarkable about 1973's biggest flops is how many have been critically re-evaluated. The Wicker Man, Badlands, and The Long Goodbye are now considered classics, while Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and Electra Glide in Blue enjoy devoted cult followings. Even Lost Horizon, though still derided for its artistic failings, has found an audience among fans of so bad they're good movies. These reevaluations didn't happen immediately. In many cases, it took decades for critics and audiences to appreciate what these films were attempting to accomplish. The rise of home video in the 1980s gave many of these commercial failures a second life, allowing viewers to discover them outside the context of their initial theatrical runs. Film schools began teaching many of these disasters as examples of innovative filmmaking, introducing new generations to works that had been rejected by their original audiences. Special edition releases, retrospective screenings, and critical reassessments gradually transformed the narrative around these films, proving that commercial performance is often a poor indicator of a film's lasting cultural significance.